June 26, 1944. Cherbourg, France. 0600 hours. The explosion came before the sound. Oberleutnant Walter Hallstein felt the pressure wave slam into his chest like a physical fist, lifting him off his feet and hurling him backward into the rubble of what had been, moments earlier, a French bakery. His left leg twisted beneath him, an unnatural angle, bone grinding against bone, and he heard himself scream, though the sound was swallowed by the thunder of American artillery that now systematically dismantled the last German defenses in the port city. Dust coated his tongue, the metallic taste of blood. Through the ringing in his ears, Hallstein registered voices, English, shouting commands he didn't understand. Boots crunched through broken glass. He tried to rise, to reach for his sidearm, but his leg buckled and white-hot pain exploded behind his eyes. The youngest law professor in Germany, dean of the faculty at age 42, architect of legal theories that had shaped the Third Reich's administrative structure, now lay helpless in the ruins of his certainty. An American soldier appeared above him, rifle pointed at his chest. Hallstein raised his hands, palms open, surrendering not just his body, but everything he had believed about American weakness, about the inevitable triumph of German will. The soldier, impossibly young, with Ohio farm dirt still visible under his fingernails, lowered his weapon and called for a medic. What Hallstein expected in that moment, a bullet, a shallow grave, the justice Germany had dispensed to millions. What he received instead would dismantle everything he thought he knew about power, about civilization, about the very nature of human society. The medic arrived within 3 minutes. Not 3 hours. Not 3 days. 3 minutes. He was black, a fact that momentarily froze Hallstein's understanding of reality, given everything he'd been taught about American racial hierarchy and the supposed inferiority of non-Aryan peoples. The medic's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away Hallstein's uniform trousers, examining the compound fracture with clinical detachment. "Morphine," the medic said to someone Hallstein couldn't see. Then, incredibly, to Hallstein himself in careful German, "This will help the pain." The needle slid into his arm. Within seconds, the agony receded to a distant throb. Through the morphine haze, Hallstein watched the medic stabilize his leg with a Thomas splint, standard American first aid equipment, he would later learn, issued to every combat unit. In Germany, such splints existed only in the best-equipped hospitals. Here, in the chaos of urban warfare, they were as common as ammunition. "Stretcher," the medic called. 4 soldiers appeared, lifting Hallstein with surprising gentleness onto canvas and poles. As they carried him through the shattered streets of Cherbourg toward the American lines, Hallstein's mind struggled to reconcile what he was experiencing with 12 years of Nazi indoctrination about American degeneracy and weakness. The processing center was a former French warehouse, now transformed into an efficient sorting machine for captured Germans. Hallstein, semi-conscious from morphine and blood loss, retained fragmentary impressions, the scratch of a fountain pen recording his name, rank, serial number. A second injection, tetanus, he heard someone say. Clean bandages wrapped around his leg with shocking abundance, as if the Americans had so much medical gauze they could afford to be wasteful. A cup of real coffee, not ersatz. Not the acorn and chicory mixture that had passed for coffee in Germany since 1941, but actual coffee, pressed into his hands by a bored-looking corporal who moved on without waiting for thanks. The surgery happened that same afternoon. No waiting, no triage list where he languished for days while his wound festered. An American doctor, a Jewish doctor, Hallstein would later discover, who had fled Berlin in 1938, explained the procedure in fluent German before administering anesthesia. They would set the bone, insert pins, clean the wound, administer sulfa drugs to prevent infection. Standard procedure, the doctor said. Standard. When Hallstein woke 12 hours later in a clean hospital bed with sheets that smelled of soap, his leg immobilized in a proper cast, he experienced his first genuine ideological crisis. The camp he'd been educated to expect, the brutality, the starvation, the vengeance, bore no resemblance to this methodical, almost boring efficiency. His injury, which would have cost him his leg or his life in a German military hospital overwhelmed by casualties, had been treated as routinely as a farmer mending a fence. The doctor checked on him the following morning. "The bone should heal completely," he said in German, making notes on a clipboard. 6 to 8 weeks. You'll walk again." Hallstein found his voice. "Why?" The doctor looked up, one eyebrow raised. "Why what? Why?" Hallstein gestured at his leg, at the clean ward around them, at the abundance that surrounded him like an accusation. "Why treat us like this?" The doctor studied him for a long moment. "The Geneva Convention requires it," he said finally. "But also—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because you're human. Because this is how civilized people behave, even toward enemies." He walked away before Hallstein could formulate a response. The Oberleutnant lay back against pillows, actual pillows, not rolled blankets, and stared at the ceiling, feeling the foundations of his worldview begin to crack. The ship that carried Hallstein and 3,200 other German prisoners across the Atlantic in August of 1944 was a converted luxury liner, the SS Mariposa, requisitioned for troop transport. The prisoners were housed below decks in spaces that had once been third-class cabins, now fitted with bunk beds stacked 4 high, cramped certainly, uncomfortable. But not the cattle cars Hallstein had seen departing from Berlin's freight yards, packed with humans destined for camps in the east. Not the sealed boxcars where people died standing up, unable to fall in the crush of bodies. They were fed twice a day. Not well, but adequately. Dehydrated potatoes, canned meat, hard bread, powdered milk reconstituted with water. Roughly 2,300 calories per man per day, more food than most German civilians had seen in years. The prisoners had access to saltwater showers. They could exercise on deck for 30 minutes daily in supervised groups. Medical staff treated seasickness, dysentery, minor injuries. Hermann Bucher, an Unteroffizier from Stuttgart captured at Normandy, spent the crossing vomiting into a bucket and arguing with Hallstein about American motives. Bucher was 24, a true believer, an early member of the Hitler Youth who could recite Mein Kampf from memory. "It's softening," Becker insisted, wiping bile from his mouth. "They feed us adequately now because they want us weak when we arrive. Then comes the real treatment, the labor camps, the starvation, the revenge." Hallstein, his broken leg healing straight and clean beneath its cast, said nothing. But doubt had begun its corrosive work. He catalogued contradictions, the American guards who played cards with prisoners during off-duty hours, the medical supplies that never seemed to run short, the structural efficiency of the ship's organization, where 3,000 prisoners were managed by fewer than 100 guards, a ratio that would have been impossible without a baseline of humane treatment that made resistance pointless. On the 8th day of crossing, a storm struck. The Mariposa pitched and rolled in 20-foot swells. Prisoners who had kept their meals down throughout the voyage now joined Bucher in misery. Hallstein, strapped to his bunk to prevent his healing leg from damage, listened to men pray in darkness as the ship groaned and shuddered. An American guard, a kid from Michigan named Patterson who couldn't have been older than 19, came below with a flashlight to check that the prisoners were secure. He found an older German, a career sergeant named Kraus, unconscious from dehydration. Patterson didn't report it and move on. He called for medical assistance. Within minutes, a doctor arrived with intravenous fluids. They set up the IV right there in the swaying, vomit-stinking hold, stabilizing Krause's condition before carrying him to the ship's infirmary. Bucher watched this with narrowed eyes. "Theater," he muttered. "Performance. Wait until we reach America." But his voice carried less conviction than before. They reached Camp Como, Mississippi on August 20th, 1944. The temperature was 96 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity thick enough to chew. Hallstein, his cast finally removed but still limping, stepped off the transport truck into air that felt like breathing through wet wool. The camp sprawled across what had been cotton fields, row after row of identical tar paper barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. Standard American military construction, functional, temporary, designed to house 5,000 men. What struck Hallstein first wasn't the camp itself, but what surrounded it: abundance. Beyond the wire, he could see the county road where civilian automobiles, private automobiles, not military vehicles, drove past without stopping. A farmer on a tractor worked a neighboring field, the machine newer and larger than anything Hallstein had seen in Germany. Telephone poles marched to the horizon, carrying copper wire to every isolated farmhouse. Even in rural Mississippi, even in the poorest state and the richest nation on earth, the infrastructure of prosperity reached everywhere. The processing took 3 hours. More paperwork, more medical examinations, more efficient American organization that treated prisoners as problems to be solved through proper procedure. Hallstein was assigned to Barracks 17, Bed 43, Storage Locker 43. He was issued work clothing, toiletries, bedding, a towel. The quartermaster sergeant who distributed these items did so with the bored competence of a man who had processed thousands of prisoners and would process thousands more. That first night, lying on a real mattress, thin but serviceable, under mosquito netting in the Mississippi heat, Hallstein listened to his fellow prisoners argue about their circumstances. "This is the show camp," insisted Hauptmann Weber, a career officer from Prussia. "They put us here where conditions are good, where we can be inspected by the Red Cross. The real camps, the camps where they'll work us to death, those are elsewhere. And yet," said Lieutenant Muller, whose brother had died in the firebombing of Hamburg, "the Red Cross inspections are random. They visit camps unannounced. I read the reports before capture. The conditions are uniform across the system." American propaganda, which we're reading in Swiss newspapers, in Swedish reports, in documents from neutral observers. How far does this propaganda extend? The argument continued into darkness. Hallstein said nothing, but he was thinking about the cast on his leg, about the surgery that had saved it, about the black medic's competent hands and the Jewish doctor's clinical efficiency. He was thinking about 2,300 calories per day on a ship, about the farmer's tractor, about telephone poles marching to infinity. He was thinking about how completely he had been wrong. The Camp University began almost accidentally in September of 1944. Hallstein, searching for something to occupy his mind beyond the cotton fields where prisoners worked 8 hours daily for 80 cents per day, began teaching informal law courses to small groups in the evenings. He had no books, no materials, only his memory of 12 years teaching at German universities. He lectured on Roman law, on the Napoleonic Code, on legal theory that carefully avoided any mention of National Socialist jurisprudence. Word spread. Within 2 weeks, 30 prisoners attended his lectures. Within a month, 60. The camp commander, Colonel Samuel Davis, a career Army officer from Virginia, heard about this development and called Hallstein to his office. Hallstein expected punishment. He received instead a proposal. "Professor Hallstein," Davis said, "not Oberleutnant, but professor, an acknowledgement of identity beyond military rank. I understand you're conducting educational programs for the men. Informal lectures only, Colonel. To pass time. Nothing that violates—" Davis waved a hand dismissively. "I'm not concerned about violations. I'm interested in expansion. The Army has authorized educational programs for prisoners of war. We can provide materials, textbooks, paper, pencils. We can designate barrack space for classroom use. We can even arrange for other qualified prisoners to teach other subjects. Mathematics, languages, history." Hallstein stared at him. Why? Davis leaned back in his chair, studying the German professor with tired eyes. Because bored men cause problems. Because educated men rebuild their country better when they go home. Because— he paused, then spoke with surprising candor. "Because this war will end eventually, and what happens after matters more than what happens during. We're not just defeating Germany. We're preparing Germans to build something better." The Camp University opened officially in October of 1944. Hallstein became its de facto administrator, organizing courses taught by 23 qualified prisoners: mathematics, physics, chemistry, English, French, philosophy, history, literature. They taught in the evenings after work details, in barrack spaces where bunks were pushed aside to make room for students sitting on the floor. The American authorities provided textbooks, American textbooks with American perspectives on history and government and science. Hallstein taught constitutional law from an English language textbook provided by the camp library. He parsed the American Constitution with the same analytical rigor he'd once applied to German civil code, expecting to find weakness, contradiction, propaganda. Instead, he found architecture, a system of checks and balances, of distributed power, of protections for individual rights that had no parallel in European legal tradition. But it's unworkable, insisted Hauptmann Weber, who attended Hallstein's lectures with skeptical determination. These enumerated powers, these restrictions on government authority, no nation can function with such limitations. Hallstein looked up from the textbook. And yet, here we are, in America, which has functioned thus for 158 years, which has built the most productive economy in human history, which is winning the war against us through sheer abundance of resources. The Constitution is just paper. All law is just paper. The question is whether people believe in it enough to follow it, whether institutions exist to enforce it, whether... He trailed off, thinking about the Jewish doctor in Cherbourg, about the Geneva Convention, about civilized people and how they behave. The transformation wasn't sudden. There was no moment of revelation, no Damascus Road conversion. Instead, Hallstein experienced a gradual accumulation of incompatible evidence, each piece grinding against his previous certainties like water wearing stone. In November, the camp held a Thanksgiving celebration. The American authorities provided turkey, real turkey, not chicken or duck or horse meat, for 5,000 prisoners. 60 tons of food prepared in army kitchens and served on real plates with real utensils. The waste alone, the leftovers scraped into garbage bins, exceeded what most German families had eaten in months. In December, the residents of Como, the small town nearest the camp, donated Christmas presents for enemy prisoners. Socks, cigarettes, candy, playing cards, small luxuries that had no strategic value, that served no purpose except human kindness. A local church group sang carols outside the wire on Christmas Eve. Silent Night, Stille Nacht, sung in English by people whose sons and brothers were fighting against Germany, sung for prisoners who represented everything Americans had crossed an ocean to defeat. Bucher, the young true believer from Stuttgart, stood beside Hallstein during the carols. His face was wet with tears. "They know we're their enemies," he whispered. "They know some of us probably killed Americans. And they sing for us. They give us gifts. I don't understand." Hallstein put a hand on the younger man's shoulder but said nothing. There were no words adequate to bridge the chasm between what they'd been taught and what they were experiencing. The ideological collapse came person by person, moment by moment, through accumulated encounters with ordinary American life. Prisoners working on nearby farms observed agricultural abundance that dwarfed anything in Germany. Combine harvesters that did the work of 30 men, silos filled with surplus grain, cattle fat and healthy in numbers that seemed impossible. Prisoners assigned to loading docks saw freight trains miles long hauling war materials west, thousands of tons of steel, rubber, ammunition, vehicles, all produced by an industrial base running at partial capacity because full production would have generated more than the military could even use. The newspapers told stories the prisoners initially refused to believe. Factory workers earning enough to buy automobiles, farmers protesting government policy without fear of arrest, labor unions negotiating with corporations while the nation fought a two-front war, political candidates openly criticizing President Roosevelt, criticizing the commander-in-chief during wartime, and facing no consequences beyond electoral defeat. It's impossible, Weber insisted during a Camp University discussion in January of 1945. No society can function with such disorder, with such lack of discipline, with such failure to subordinate individual interest to national need. And yet, Muller replied quietly, which society is winning the war? The question hung in the air like smoke. Around them, 60 prisoners sat in silence, each man conducting his own internal reckoning with reality. In March of 1945, Hallstein was selected for the Sunflower Project, though he didn't learn that name until much later. The official designation was Administrative School. 6 German officers, chosen for their education and leadership potential, would attend a 6-week program at Fort Getty in Rhode Island, studying American government and administration. Hallstein almost refused. The offer felt like collaboration, like betrayal of Germany, even as Germany collapsed under Allied bombing and Soviet advance. But curiosity won. The same intellectual drive that had made him the youngest full professor in Germany now demanded that he understand this civilization that had defeated his own so completely. Fort Getty was not a prisoner of war camp. It was a training facility for American officers, temporarily repurposed for the re-education program. Hallstein and his 5 fellow Germans were housed in regular barracks, 8 in the regular mess hall, attended lectures alongside American soldiers preparing for post-war occupation duty. They were prisoners only in the technical sense. In practice, they were students. The curriculum focused on American constitutional democracy, the separation of powers, federalism, civil liberties, judicial review. The instructors were civilian academics, many of them refugees from Nazi Germany, who now taught in American universities. They approached their subject not with propaganda or coercion, but with the dispassionate analysis Hallstein recognized from his own legal training. Professor Ernst Fraenkel, a German Jewish lawyer who had escaped to America in 1938, taught constitutional theory. The genius of the American system, he explained, lies not in preventing bad men from gaining power. That's impossible, but in preventing powerful men from doing unlimited harm. Power divided is power constrained. Authority distributed is authority accountable. But this creates inefficiency, Hallstein objected during one seminar. Gridlock. Paralysis when decisive action is needed. Fraenkel smiled. Yes, exactly. The American system prefers deadlock to dictatorship. It sacrifices efficiency for security. It accepts that some good things won't happen in order to ensure that many terrible things cannot happen. And this works? You're sitting in America, Professor Hallstein. Germany lies in ruins. Which system worked? The question was rhetorical, but Hallstein spent that night unable to sleep, working through the implications. He thought about the Enabling Act of 1933, which had granted Hitler dictatorial powers, about the efficiency of Nazi administration, which could mobilize the entire nation toward war without democratic debate or judicial oversight, about the weakness of Weimar democracy, paralyzed by competing factions, unable to act decisively. And he thought about the cost, the millions dead, the cities burned, the civilization destroyed, all that terrible efficiency mobilized toward catastrophe. The real education came not in the classroom, but in the freedom to observe America without constraint. On weekends, the German officers were allowed supervised trips into Providence, accompanied by guards who were more tour guides than jailers. They walked streets where shops sold goods without ration cards, where restaurants served meals to anyone with money, where Newsstand S displayed a dozen competing newspapers offering a dozen different interpretations of the same events. Hallstein bought 3 newspapers one Saturday and read them over lunch. The Providence Journal supported the Republican Party. The Providence Tribune supported the Democrats. A socialist paper supported neither. All 3 criticized the government. All 3 discussed the same war, the same battles, the same losses, but drew different conclusions about what it meant, what should happen next, who deserved blame or credit. "This is chaos," said Hauptmann Koch, one of the other German officers on the program. "No unified message, no coordination. How do people know what to believe?" "They decide for themselves," Hallstein said slowly, feeling his way toward understanding. "No one tells them. They read competing sources and form their own conclusions. But most people are too stupid." "Are they?" Hallstein gestured at the prosperous street around them, at the abundance visible in every shop window. "These stupid people built the most powerful nation on earth. These stupid people are beating us. Perhaps stupidity looks different than we were taught. That night, Hallstein began drafting notes for what would eventually become his political philosophy, the doctrine that national sovereignty was the ideology of yesterday, that peace required supranational authority, that preventing war mattered more than preserving traditional power structures. The ideas were inchoate, fragmentary, contradictory, but they represented the first seeds of what would grow into the European Union. The war ended while Hallstein was at Fort Getty. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The German officers learned of their nation's surrender from American radio broadcasts that played in the mess hall. There were no celebrations in their presence, no gloating, no triumph directed at the defeated enemy. The American soldiers simply went about their business, relief visible in faces that no longer had to contemplate their own deaths in combat. Hallstein felt nothing, or rather, he felt too much to process. Grief for a Germany that no longer existed, shame for what that Germany had become, confusion about what would happen next. He was 43 years old, a prisoner of war, a citizen of a nation that had ceased to exist as a political entity. His career, his identity, his entire understanding of how the world worked had collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. Professor Frankl found him that evening, sitting alone in the barracks, staring at nothing. "Professor Hallstein," Frankl said gently, "may I sit?" Hallstein gestured at the adjacent bunk. Frankl sat, silent for a moment before speaking. "I left Germany 7 years ago. I watched from here as my country destroyed itself. I know something of what you're feeling." "Do you?" Hallstein's voice was harsh. "You escaped. You were right to leave. I stayed. I served. I was complicit in—" He stopped, unable to finish. "You were a law professor. You taught legal theory. You weren't—" "I taught law in a lawless state. I provided academic legitimacy to a regime that—" Again he stopped. "I didn't see. I didn't want to see. And now—" "Now you see," Frankl said quietly. "And that's why you're valuable. Because you can go home and help others see. Help rebuild Germany into something better. I'm a prisoner of war. I'll go home to face denazification tribunals, to lose my position, maybe not. But Germany will need people who understand both worlds, the Germany that was and the Germany that could be. People who can bridge the gap between what was and what should be. People like you." Hallstein looked at the older man. "Why? Why do you care what happens to Germany? After everything?" Frankl smiled sadly. "Because I'm still German. Because the Germany that expelled me also produced Goethe and Beethoven and Kant. Because nations, like people, can change, must change. And you, Professor Hallstein, whether you know it or not, have already changed." Hallstein returned to Camp Como in June of 1945. The atmosphere had shifted with the war's end. Prisoners no longer labored under the shadow of ongoing combat. Instead, they waited for repatriation, for processing, for whatever came next. The camp university continued, now with enhanced resources. The American authorities provided more books, more materials, even guest lecturers from nearby universities. Hallstein taught constitutional law with new intensity, drawing on what he'd learned at Fort Getty. His lectures became explorations of political philosophy, of how societies organize themselves, of what prevents power from corrupting absolutely. He spoke of federalism and checks and balances not as abstract theory, but as living practice he'd observed in America. Bucher, the former true believer, now studied English with fierce dedication. "I need to understand them," he explained when Hallstein asked why, how they think, how they organize. "Because we'll have to rebuild Germany, and we can't rebuild it the way it was." Müller, whose brother had died in Hamburg, spent his evenings reading American newspapers, tracking the Nuremberg trials, the denazification programs, the occupation policies. "They're making mistakes," he said one night. "The occupation authorities. They're too harsh in some ways, too lenient in others." "They don't understand Germany, do we?" Hallstein asked. "Understand Germany? After everything?" Müller had no answer. The repatriation began in October of 1945. Prisoners departed in groups, processed through transit camps, loaded onto ships for the Atlantic crossing. Hallstein left Camp Como on November 15, 1945, 17 months after his capture, 16 months after his surgery, 15 months after his worldview began its transformation. The ship that carried him home was another converted liner, the SS James Parker. Conditions were worse than on the Mariposa, post-war austerity affecting even American abundance, but still adequate. 2,100 calories per day. Saltwater showers, medical care. The same efficiency, now tinged with eagerness to be done with the task of managing enemy prisoners. Hallstein stood on deck as the ship approached Hamburg in early December. The city he'd known was gone. Where factories and warehouses had stood, there was rubble. Where apartment buildings had housed families, there were ruins. The scale of destruction exceeded anything he'd seen in newsreels or newspapers. Germany had been dismantled systematically and thoroughly, reduced to its component stones. But among the ruins he saw something else. People. Women clearing rubble brick by brick. Children playing in bombed-out buildings. Old men organizing work crews. Life, stubborn and persistent, refusing to be extinguished even in catastrophe. The Germany Hallstein returned to in December 1945 barely resembled the nation he'd left 17 months earlier. Food was scarce, genuinely scarce, not the artificial scarcity of wartime rationing, but the actual absence of sufficient calories to sustain life. The black market flourished, currency was worthless. People traded cigarettes for bread, silk stockings for meat, family heirlooms for firewood. The Bavarian Ministry of Economics offered Hallstein a deputy minister position. He declined. Instead, he joined the effort to reopen Frankfurt University, closed since March when American troops had occupied the city. He worked alongside other returnees, former soldiers, former prisoners, men who had seen the wider world and brought back new ideas. In April of 1946, the university reopened with Hallstein as its rector. He was 44 years old, his broken leg occasionally aching in cold weather. His understanding of law and politics fundamentally transformed from the man who'd taught in Nazi Germany. His inaugural address, delivered in the university's restored auditorium, argued for a new approach to legal education, one grounded in constitutional democracy, in protection of individual rights, in limitation of state power. We must reject the doctrine that might makes right, he told the assembled students and faculty. We must embrace instead the principle that right makes might, that legitimate authority derives not from force, but from consent, not from power, but from law. This is what I learned in captivity. This is what I bring back to build anew. The audience received his words in silence. Some understood immediately. Others would take years to accept what Hallstein was saying. But seeds were planted in that moment, seeds of a constitutional democracy that would eventually flourish in West Germany, seeds of European integration that would grow into something unprecedented in history. From 1948 to 1949, Hallstein taught at Georgetown University in Washington, a guest professorship that let him study American law more deeply, that connected him with American policymakers planning Europe's reconstruction. He returned to Germany in 1949 as the Federal Republic was being established, as the new Constitution was being drafted, as the shape of post-war Europe began to emerge. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer summoned him to Bonn in 1950. The Schuman Plan, a French proposal to place coal and steel production under supranational authority, needed German participation. Would Hallstein lead the German delegation in negotiations? Hallstein accepted immediately. Here was the opportunity to implement what he'd learned in Mississippi and Rhode Island, that sovereignty shared was sovereignty strengthened, that nations working together could prevent the wars that had destroyed Europe twice in 30 years, that peace required institutional architecture as solid as the constitutional checks and balances he'd studied in American textbooks. He worked with Jean Monnet, the French architect of European integration, to develop the Schuman Plan into the European coal and steel community. The negotiations were complex, technical, boring to outside observers, but Hallstein understood their revolutionary nature. This was the first time in European history that nations had voluntarily surrendered sovereignty to a supranational institution, accepting external constraints on their power in service of a larger peace. The treaty establishing the European Coal and Steel Community was signed on April 18, 1951. 6 nations, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, agreed to pool their coal and steel resources under a high authority that answered to no single nation. It was federalism, American style, adapted to European conditions. It was the Constitution's checks and balances reimagined for an international context. It was everything Hallstein had learned in captivity, now built into the structure of European politics. From 1951 to 1958, Hallstein served as State Secretary of the Foreign Office, the highest-ranking civil servant in West Germany's diplomatic corps, effectively serving as foreign minister without the title. He negotiated West Germany's reintegration into international society, its membership in NATO, its recognition as a legitimate state. He argued consistently for deeper European integration, for economic cooperation that would make war impossible, for institutions that would transcend national sovereignty. When the European Economic Community was established in 1958, expanding the coal and steel community into a common market, the 6 member states unanimously elected Hallstein as the first president of the Commission. He was 56 years old, 13 years removed from his release from Camp Como, 14 years removed from his capture at Cherbourg. In his inaugural address as Commission President, Hallstein described himself as a sort of European Prime Minister, a provocative claim that outraged defenders of national sovereignty, but accurately characterized his vision. He saw the Commission not as a mere administrative body, but as the nucleus of a future United States of Europe, as an institution that would gradually accumulate power and authority until it could prevent the nationalism that had destroyed the continent. National sovereignty, he declared, is the doctrine of yesterday. It led us to catastrophe. It must be transcended if Europe is to have a future. Critics accused him of betraying Germany, of serving foreign interests, of selling out national identity for abstract internationalism. They didn't understand or refused to understand that Hallstein's vision came not from ideology, but from experience, from 17 months observing a civilization that had solved the problem of distributed power, from witnessing abundance that made conflict obsolete, from learning that democracy wasn't weakness but strength, that rights protected made societies flourish, that institutions properly designed could prevent the horrors he'd seen consume Germany. Hallstein served as Commission President until 1967, steering the European Economic Community through its formative years, establishing precedents and procedures that would shape European integration for decades. He retired from politics in 1969, but continued writing and speaking about European unity until his death in 1982 at age 80. His obituaries barely mentioned his military service or captivity. They focused on his role as a founding father of Europe, as an architect of integration, as a statesman who had helped build peace from the ruins of war. But those who knew his full story understood that everything he accomplished after 1945 traced back to those 17 months in Mississippi, to the education of a prisoner who learned from his captors what his own nation had failed to teach him. The statistics tell part of the story. Of 371,683 German prisoners of war held in America from 1943 to 1946, only 0.6% attempted escape. Compare this to American prisoners in Germany, where escape attempts were routine, where survival rates were significantly lower, where treatment violated Geneva Conventions systematically. Approximately 60% of non-political German prisoners showed measurable ideological change after just 6 months in American custody. 74% supported democratic government upon repatriation. 5,000 emigrated permanently to America. Thousands more implemented American agricultural methods, industrial techniques, and democratic principles in rebuilding West Germany. But numbers alone cannot capture the transformation that occurred in those 500 camps scattered across America. They cannot convey the cumulative impact of small encounters, the black medic's competent hands, the Jewish doctor's professionalism, the Christmas carols sung by civilians for enemy prisoners, the textbooks distributed freely, the Constitution taught without coercion, the abundance visible everywhere, like an accusation against everything prisoners had been taught about American weakness. Hermann Bucher, the young Nazi who arrived at Camp Herne in June of 1943, expecting brutality and finding humanity, returned to Germany in 1946 and became a teacher. He taught his students about democracy, about constitutional rights, about the danger of unchecked power. He never forgot the Christmas gifts from the residents of Herne, the kindness extended to enemies who perhaps did not deserve it. Walter Miller, whose brother died in Hamburg, emigrated to America in 1952 and became a machinist in Detroit. He raised 3 children who never learned German, who grew up American, who knew their father's story only in fragments. But they understood somehow that their father had been saved, not just physically but spiritually, by a civilization that treated even its enemies with dignity. And Walter Hallstein, the youngest law professor in Germany, captured at Cherbourg with a broken leg and broken certainties, became the architect of a peaceful Europe that had eluded statesmen for centuries. He built institutions that prevented war not through military might, but through economic integration. He created a framework where national sovereignty was voluntarily limited in service of collective prosperity. He took what he learned in Mississippi and Rhode Island and transformed it into the European Union, an imperfect, frustrating, bureaucratic achievement that nonetheless represents humanity's most successful experiment in transcending nationalism. America's greatest victory in World War II was not Normandy or Midway or the Bulge. It was the silent victory won in prisoner of war camps where ordinary aspects of American life, so mundane for Americans that they barely registered, revolutionized the worldview of men who had been taught that democracy was weakness, that abundance was impossible, that power unconstrained was the natural order. The prisoners saw illuminated cities during wartime blackouts, proving that American industrial capacity exceeded what propaganda had claimed. They saw factories producing more in a day than Germany managed in weeks, making Allied victory mathematically inevitable. They saw farmers openly criticizing the president without fear, demonstrating that freedom of speech wasn't weakness, but strength. They saw Black Americans and white Americans working alongside each other with more equality than propaganda had admitted existed. They saw Jews in positions of authority, treating German prisoners with professionalism and detachment, refuting every anti-Semitic lie they'd been taught. They saw, in other words, the truth. And truth, accumulated observation by observation, episode by episode, proved more powerful than any propaganda, more transformative than any re-education program could have been if imposed by force. The Sunflower Project, the classified program that educated German prisoners like Hallstein in American constitutional democracy, was one of the most successful ideological transformation initiatives in military history. But it succeeded not because of clever propaganda or psychological manipulation. It succeeded because it exposed prisoners to the reality of American life and let that reality speak for itself. Hallstein's broken leg, set with pins and wrapped in clean bandages by a system that had medical supplies to waste, told him more about American civilization than any lecture could have. The Christmas carols sung by people whose sons were dying fighting Germans told him more about American values than any textbook. The abundance visible everywhere, the waste, the casual disposal of food and materials that would have been treasured in Germany, told him more about industrial capacity than any intelligence report. And most importantly, the constitutional system he studied, the separation of powers, the federalism, the checks and balances, the protection of rights even for unpopular speech, showed him how democracy actually worked, how it prevented tyranny not through the goodness of leaders, but through the architecture of institutions. This was the education that transformed Hallstein from a Wehrmacht officer to a founding father of the European Union. This was the invisible victory that reshaped Europe more thoroughly than any military campaign could have. And this was the power of demonstrating through actions rather than words what civilization looks like when it takes its own principles seriously. In 1982, when Walter Hallstein died at age 80, obituaries appeared in newspapers across Europe and America. They praised his role in European integration, his diplomatic skill, his vision of a unified continent. None mentioned that his vision originated in a Mississippi cotton field, in a prisoner of war camp where the youngest law professor in Germany learned from his captors how to build a better world. But perhaps that omission was appropriate, because the real story wasn't about Hallstein alone. It was about 371,683 German prisoners who passed through American camps and emerged changed. About tens of thousands who returned to Germany carrying new ideas about democracy, prosperity, human dignity, about a generation of Germans who rebuilt their nation using principles learned from their enemies. The camps are gone now, the barracks torn down, the land returned to farmers, the guard towers dismantled. Nothing visible remains of the places where this transformation occurred. But the institutions those former prisoners helped build, the Democratic Federal Republic of Germany, the European Union, the post-war peace that has lasted longer than any peace in European history, these are the invisible monuments to America's greatest and least celebrated victory. Walter Hallstein's broken leg healed straight and clean, testimony to American medical competence. His broken certainties never healed. Instead, they remained fractured, unable to support the weight of totalitarian ideology, forcing him to build new foundations based on what he'd learned in captivity. That power shared is power strengthened, that rights protected create prosperity, that democracy isn't weakness, but civilization's highest achievement, that education received unwillingly from enemies who became teachers changed the course of history. Not through the thunder of artillery or the roar of bombers, but through the quiet accumulation of incompatible evidence that forced one man and thousands like him to acknowledge that everything they'd believed was wrong. And in acknowledging that wrongness, in accepting that transformation, they helped build a world where such catastrophic certainties would be harder to establish, harder to sustain, less likely to destroy civilization again. That was the true education of the prisoners. That was America's invisible victory. And that was the gift, unwanted but ultimately accepted, that Walter Hallstein carried from a Mississippi cotton field to the halls of power in Brussels, where he used what he'd learned to ensure that Europe would never again tear itself apart in fratricidal war. The irony was lost on no one who knew the full story, that Germany's defeat became Europe's salvation, that American abundance transformed German poverty into prosperity, that a broken leg in Cherbourg began a journey that would end with a peaceful, united continent. But perhaps irony was the wrong word. Perhaps it was simply justice, the justice of demonstrating through treatment of enemies what civilization really means, the justice of showing through generosity what strength really requires, the justice of proving through patient education that democracy works not despite its limitations, but because of them. Walter Hallstein learned that lesson in captivity, and he spent the rest of his life teaching it to others, building institutions that would embody it, creating a Europe where national sovereignty, the doctrine of yesterday, gave way to something unprecedented, a voluntary union of nations, surrendering power to preserve peace, accepting limitations to secure prosperity. That Europe, imperfect as it remains, stands as testimony to what one man learned in a prisoner of war camp in Mississippi, to what thousands learned in camps across America, to the power of example over coercion, of abundance over scarcity, of freedom over force. It stands in the end as proof that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet transformation of minds and hearts, in the patient demonstration that another way is possible, in the stubborn refusal to treat enemies as less than human, even when they've behaved as if humanity means nothing. That was America's gift to Walter Hallstein. That was what he gave back to Europe. And that was the invisible victory that echoes still in every peaceful day that Europe enjoys, every democratic election in Germany, every act of cooperation between nations that once tried to destroy each other. The camp in Mississippi changed history. The prisoner became president of the European Commission. And the world became safer because one man, with a broken leg and broken certainties, learned from his captors how to build institutions that would make such catastrophes less likely to recur. That is the story. That is the lesson. That is the legacy of 17 months in captivity that transformed not just one man, but an entire continent.